Now thrive the armourers. Hello, I'm Guy Wilson, and Liveryman K. Smith and I are your guides through the 700 years of the Armourers and Brasiers Company.
The beginning of the 18th century found London still coming to terms with the disasters and profound changes of the second half of the 17th century, as Cathy Ross, former curator of social history at the Museum of London, explains.
Well, the fire was an enormous catastrophe for London. Most of the city within the walls was burnt, destroyed. People fled and left the city as a complete wasteland. It took about 30 years or so to really get back on its feet again. And as you can imagine, it took a while to rebuild, and buildings like St. Paul's Cathedral didn't open until the early years of the 18th century. So that was 50 years since the disaster. So in many ways, London was a city trying to find its feet again. But during that period, there were other big, important things that happened, mainly the revolution, the Glorious Revolution of 1688, which brought a new Protestant monarch to the throne, William of Orange, but ushered in a whole new climate of Enlightenment opinion. So things changed, like the financial system. We get the foundation of the Bank of England, and you get the beginning of a much more outward-looking London, which sees ships and trade and commerce going out all over the world to bring wealth to this one capital city.
For the company, the final decades of the 17th century had been a time of severe retrenchment and hardship. And matters were made even worse due to the demise of the wearing of armour, as Tom Richardson, former curator of armour at the Royal Armourers, reminds us.
By the end of the 17th century, the wearing of armour on the battlefield would disappear, except for a few siege workers and engineers, for over a century.
But, as ever, the armourers were resourceful. So, as armour went out of use and orders dried up, most of them moved their businesses to the manufacture of brasswares, the braziers trade. In fact, many members of the company were already braziers, and it's worth noting that the skills needed to make armour and to make wares such as pans, dishes, vats and cauldrons were very similar.
But unlike the armour trade, which was good in times of war but not in times of peace, there was a constant and growing need for brassware. So, as the armourer's trade died out, the trade in brasswares rose in importance, and by the beginning of the 18th century, members of the company were predominantly braziers. But the company was still called the Worshipful Company of Armourers. Something needed to change, as Libby Glover, liveryman and the company's historian, makes clear.
Armour was no longer being a major feature of the company's activities, and the people in the company were making money out of brassware rather than out of making armour. And it was felt to be inappropriate to be so dependent on a charter which was essentially for armour making. Some members of the company are misled by the coat of arms, I think, as much as anything, in thinking that the Brasiers Company was a company which amalgamated with the Armourers, but not. It wasn't. The charter represents a recognition of the status of the Brasiers in the company. The very important Brasiers within the company proceeded to petition for a new charter in 1706, which was granted by Queen Anne in 1708.
Beside a new charter, the company needed other things too. Here's Libby again.
The acquisition of the new charter meant that the company needed a new coat of arms and a new seal. They negotiated with the College of Arms for the new coat of arms, but never paid for it. And this had to be corrected in the 1960s. And one of the members of the court resigned because he thought it had been so appalling that they'd used it all this time and never paid the College of Arms for doing it. They used it illegally, really. And of course, because of this, they also had to have a new seal.
A key figure in the acquisition of the new charter was John Appleby, who, to mark the change, commissioned the enormous painting of the new coat of arms, which hangs today on the main landing of the hall. And you can't miss the very large letters of the inscription: "The gift of John Appleby, Master, 1710."
Now, John Appleby was a very successful brazier who by the first decade of the 18th century had amassed considerable wealth. Both his brothers and his sons were also active in the trade and the company. But the brazier's trade has not been much researched, so despite their success we knew relatively little about the Applebys or what they made until Valentine and Roderick Butler became interested in the products of their workshops, especially warming pans, and managed to identify the mark of John's son, Charles Appleby. Roderick explains.
Well, yes, they fascinated us from 20-odd years ago. We had an exhibition. We had 3 pieces in that exhibition with marks on, a brass candlestick and 2 mortars, all with the same mark. Various other colleagues had found the same thing, and we thought, that's quite a lot of marked pieces. Now, that suggests to us that it was quite a big production, because so little survives with maker's marks. Since then, warming pans have turned up with the CAP mark, and there are probably now 20, maybe 30 warming pans with this mark CAP. And we know that that is Charles Appleby because it's in the records. The other mark, which is CA in a lozenge, didn't quite fit. Now, we couldn't work out, was this another founder? And over the years, we came to the conclusion that Appleby marked his warming pans, which were sheet metal, with a wider mark, easy to stamp, and the cast goods he marked with CA. That has borne out with all the pieces we found. We found about 20, 25 pieces, something like that. Colleagues have probably 2 or 3 times as many pieces. This was a big operation. And then to find the Appleby trade card in the British Library was brilliant, because that gave us an address, it gave us Appleby and Son, and it says brassware and exportation. This was a big business.
It is clear that members of the company, like the Applebys, took advantage of the changes and opportunities that took place as London became a major European city, as Cathy explains.
The old trades of London flourished in this period because although before the Great Fire the market had been largely English, with these new trade connections and with the growth of London as an international port, new markets begin to open up and manufacturers find new ways of generating wealth through selling materials to the new plantations in the New World or in other parts of Europe. During this period, London becomes the major European port for re-exported goods. It used to be that Amsterdam was the main European port for re-exported goods. But in the early 18th century, London overtakes Amsterdam and becomes the main European centre for international commerce. And that really benefits all the old industries of London. Whatever they're making, everything multiplies in the amount of goods they're making and the amount of people they're employing. And London starts to grow, and by the end of the 18th century, it's the biggest city in Europe, an absolute phenomenon that Europe hasn't seen before.
The Appleby family died out in the middle of the century. However, another family, and one that is still very much with us today, rose to prominence in the trade and the company, the Pontifexes, as Anthony Pontifex has written in the recent history of the company's treasures.
The story begins with William Pontifex from Iver in Buckinghamshire, who was apprenticed to a relation, London coppersmith Richard Jones, in 1781. In 1788, William went into partnership with Jones. After Jones' death in 1793, and until his own in 1851, William formed a number of other partnerships and companies. Their copper plates for engravers are known to have been used by a number of artists, including William Blake, Thomas Gainsborough, Thomas Bewick and Goya. In parallel with his business in brass and copper, William was rising in the Armourers and Brasiers, becoming renter-warden in 1815 and master in 1817. William's three brothers, Daniel, John and Russell, followed him into the company. In all, about 15 members of the family have served as master of the company, and in addition, many have been generous benefactors to the hall.
As the century progressed, the company expanded its presence in Coleman Street, as Roger Bowdler, architectural historian and upper warden, explains.
So the Armourers arrived in Coleman Street at the Dragon Tavern in 1428, and there they remain to this day, which is quite a thought. We're still on the same spot as we arrived in the early 15th century. We remained there and slowly started to acquire further properties in the later 18th century. So we acquired the present plot that we now occupy at the very end of the 18th century.
And in this age of increasing wealth and elegance, the company turned its attention to the furnishing and equipping of the hall. Fashionable china and silver cutlery were ordered, new furnishings and paintings were acquired, and the three splendid chandeliers that still adorn the livery hall today were installed. It seems that everyone wanted to show off and demonstrate just how important London was, as Cathy Ross makes clear.
One of the symbols of London in the 18th century is the Lord Mayor's coach, which was unveiled in 1757. It was first used in 1757. And it really is a statement of London's European predominance. It uses an Italian painter to decorate it. He's an émigré painter who was living in London. It's in the French style. It uses German technology. Previous to the mid-18th century, English coaches had been rather heavy, and this is a light Berlin-style coach. And this was ordered by the Lord Mayor. It was a really up-to-the-minute object which symbolised London's success as a centre of this great network of military and commercial trading and commerce and activity.
You can still see the coach every year as a major feature of the Lord Mayor's show.
In earlier times, the company had taken part in the procession of boats and barges that accompanied the Lord Mayor to Westminster, where he took his annual oath of allegiance. And it became a tradition that on his return to the city, members of the company provided him with an armed and armoured escort. And this tradition continued as the pageant along the Thames gave way to a procession through the streets of the city, as Ruth Brown, an historian and co-author of the recent book on the company's treasures, explains.
For many years, the company kept in their attic 12 pikemen's armours and pikes, along with a dozen matchlocks and 24 swords, which would form an oppressive guard for the Lord Mayor. However, by the mid-18th century, the armours had become very shabby, and the guns and swords had gone missing. So instead of providing the Lord Mayor with a guard of 24 members of the company, a single member, clad head to toe in steel, rode a horse in the parade. At first the armour was hired, but in 1768 the master, William Carter, presented it to the company as a gift.
Although its significance was not then realised, this armour proved to be one of the utmost importance and relevance to the company. One of the suits made in the Royal Workshops at Greenwich for Sir Henry Lee, master of the armouries in the late 16th century, and you can still see it in the hall today.
Then in 1784 the company received another addition to their armoury, when the master, Thomas Harrison, presented a complete suit of brass armour for the use of the Lord Mayor's procession. Now, with a coat of brass mail acquired earlier and the Lee armour, the armourers could equip 3 men for the Lord Mayor's day. And they made quite an impression, as this contemporary newspaper shows.
The man in armour, who has been absent for several years, deserves some particular notice. We understand that he who enacted this distinguished character is a Mr. Moore of the Armourers Brasiers Company. He was mounted on a very fine dark gelding, the head, mane and shoulders of the animal covered also with armour, ornamented with roses of poppy and white ribbons, silver fringe and plumes of ostrich feathers, a very terrific appearance. He was attended by 12 lifeguards with spears and ready to repel any who should have the hardihood to assail either them or their champion. They, together with the 3 men in armour on foot, rendered this part of the procession very attractive.
In its anniversary year, the company resurrected its major presence in the show, reviving its tradition of providing an armed escort for the mayor.
Over the course of the 18th century, the company continued to thrive, to diversify and adapt to the changes going on around it, though members of the company were still primarily manufacturers, merchants and industrialists. Over the course of the next century, the company was to change to one full of professionals, lawyers, bankers and stockbrokers, and they decided that their old hall was inadequate. And as we'll see next time, they built themselves an imposing and splendid new hall.
This has been a Past Master production for Basilisco Press. Next time, the days of craft companies are over. The city changes, and once again the Armourers and Brasiers must change to survive and prosper. Our thanks to Roger Bowdler, Ruth Brown, Roderick Butler, Libby Glover, Tom Richardson and Cathy Ross.